Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, June 1st, 2021. Happy June. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Florida gubernatorial election in which Nikki Fried, the current and only statewide elected Democrat, has now announced her bid for governor in the state of Florida, challenging Governor Ron DeSantis in the 2022 governor election down here. So looking at the state of Florida, Nikki Fried is currently the agricultural commissioner. So it doesn't seem like a very notable position, but she was elected back in 2018 by a very narrow margin. She was elected by around 5,000 votes out of over 8 million cast across the state. So an extremely close race. It was down to the narrowest of margins. And while she was the victor, it wasn't a very large victory, but I'm not going to take that away from her. She was working against what seemingly was a lot of, negative odds. You saw Rick Scott, the Republican, defeat Bill Nelson by 0.2%. You saw Ron DeSantis win against Andrew Gillum by 0.4%. You saw all of the major races won by Republicans in Florida, largely because the state is immune to wave years. So what does that mean? If it's a Democratic wave year, Florida is still close. If it's a Republican wave year, Florida is still close. 2014, 2010, take a look at those governor elections, and you might find it quite interesting. Because while Rick Scott won twice, he only won by 2% or less. So didn't necessarily have promising victories despite both of those years, 2010 and 2014, being overwhelmingly Republican years. 2018 rolled around, and Nikki Fried was still able to win that race, but she didn't do it easily. 2018 results show that Ron DeSantis was still the victor of the governor election, even though the Democrats were up 8 points on the national average, and they were able to win a lot of competitive states, a lot of competitive governor elections as well. Florida simply wasn't one of them. Florida was only won by the Republicans, even though by a narrow margin, was won against what was a Democratic wave year, I would argue. And, Ron DeSantis' victory did raise questions about the Democratic primary with Andrew Gillum, who was largely viewed as the candidate who wasn't going to win. I mean, Gwen Graham was the daughter of the former governor of the state and was seemingly the shoo-in candidate for this Democratic nomination. And some people question whether or not she would have won the governor election because Andrew Gillum was the more progressive and more left-wing choice than Gwen Graham. And we all know that Florida isn't necessarily a state too accepting towards progressives. Take a look at the House election results in 2020 or the presidential primaries of 2016 and 2020 and the election results of both elections as well. So Ron DeSantis' victory also doesn't seem too I would say impressive, but Ron DeSantis is at a better foot than he was back in 2018. This race was absolutely winnable for the Democrats, and they really just dropped the ball in the state of Florida, largely because Bill Nelson or Democrats couldn't carry themselves across the line, and I think that Andrew Gillum would have won had Bill Nelson won. But of course, that's all speculation. I don't have true evidence to prove that, obviously, because that reality never really occurred, but we're just going to be looking at the election results. And like I had said, the Republicans did win a number of the notable elections down that ballot. This race here was extremely competitive. I mean, Nikki Fried was not the incumbent, and she defeated Matt Caldwell by a margin of 5,000 votes out of over 8 million cast. I mean, you're looking at nearly 8.1 million votes, and 5,000 made all the difference. So while Nikki Fried is that only elected statewide Democrat, and I will say that is a major plus, she still wasn't one that was overwhelmingly, chosen or won by an overwhelming amount. She simply was, not to say lucky, but did survive what was largely a Republican takeover across the state. So Governor Ron DeSantis, why is this a race that the Democratic Party is heavily targeting? Well, if you know anything about Florida politics, you'll know that the former governor has already announced that he is also running for the state. He actually is the former Republican governor before Rick Scott. Quite interesting to see. Almost became a senator back in 2010 and ran for governor again in 2014. Only lost by around 1 point as well, and now is running for a governor in this state. So Charlie Crist, who is he? Like I had mentioned, all of those things behind him, but what does he represent now? Well, he's sort of a more moderate-toned Democrat, I would say a centrist with a little bit of left-leaning. It's not really, a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren type of candidate, but he's not necessarily Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema either. He's somewhere around the mix, probably Joe Biden, Kamala Harris-esque, someone who is more establishment, more traditional, more centrist. Nikki Fried, I would say, is a little bit of that, but she also seems to offer this new, younger vision and this more optimistic and pragmatic approach to the Florida governor election. I mean, she's been a very firm critic of Ron DeSantis over the past couple of months, and it's been very clear what her intentions were eventually going to be. It was very clear that she was going to eventually announce that she was running for governor in this state. I mean, looking at it, it's a state that is almost always competitive, and considering the past 2 election results, while Democrats did lose, they still came pretty close. But Ron DeSantis is in a pretty powerful position at this point. If you're looking at the approval rating of him, even though he seems to have handled COVID very differently than other, governors in swing states, he still has a high approval rating. Amongst the Florida people, he has a 53% approval rating, and it says 55% in another poll released through the Florida Chamber of Commerce. So, looking at this data, if anything, Ron DeSantis is approved of by the people of Florida, not disapproved of. So this makes it difficult for Nikki Fried to run, but the fact that she's even announcing, I think, is something we largely expected, but now officially puts it underway. Because this announcement does mean that Ron DeSantis will still be in a position where there will be some firm Democratic opposition. I mean, just because he's popular doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't have to worry about this race. Because the end goal for Ron DeSantis isn't necessarily being reelected, but it becomes increasingly and increasingly more clear as the days go on that his end goal is the White House. Yes, you heard me correctly. Ron DeSantis seems to be on a way in which he is going to eventually run for president in 2024. Now, if you look at the election data, you might think, oh, what is a governor from Florida going to do when, you have Ted Cruz, Mike Pence, Donald Trump Jr., Nikki Haley on the ballot? But based off this data, Ron DeSantis is number 2, and in many cases, number 1. If you're looking at the data without President Trump, Ron DeSantis always polls first or second. You don't get around that. And it is quite interesting to see, considering that he's not someone who was elected by an overwhelmingly large margin. I mean, I would understand if Ron DeSantis had won the state of Florida by 20 points or 15 points as someone who was an overwhelmingly popular governor in a swing state. And I wouldn't necessarily call him not popular, but he's not overwhelmingly popular. And that 55% approval rating, I will say, is good. And I think him being from Florida does sort of click in the eyes and minds of many Republican voters and say, he would offer some type of electoral advantage. But I will also say that just the fact that his name is circulated around the media so quickly and so frequently, that has certainly boosted his name recognition and boosted his chances at the nomination in 2024. So what I'm looking at here is that Ron DeSantis' endgame is the White House. It's not winning re-election. It's not defeating Nikki Fried. It's getting into the White House. And at this point, based off these numbers, he very well could get there. Because if President Trump does decide not to run, his next biggest adversary would be Mike Pence. And even then, Mike Pence probably won't be running for president in 2024. And even if he does, it's DeSantis. He's at second place, with Cruz at 12, with with Trump Jr. at 13, with Haley at 5. All of those people, if they eventually decide not to run, all of their supporters, 95%, will go over to Ron DeSantis. Because Mike Pence has fallen out of favor amongst voters, amongst the Republican Party in general, you will likely see a very large portion gang up against him. And that will largely benefit Ron DeSantis if he is that go-to nominee or that go-to Republican Party candidate. So looking at the 2024 election, Ron DeSantis seems to be someone who certainly wants to run in this election. But it would be a requirement, more of a prerequisite, that he wins this governor election against Nikki Fried. And while she doesn't necessarily pose a threat now, I certainly could see her making this race more competitive. I mean, she is the only statewide elected Democrat, and that could be something that does help. But amongst polls, looking at the data amongst Democrats, Nikki Fried does not defeat Charlie Crist. Now, I think this is interesting. Even though, Nikki Fried isn't as recognizable as Charlie Crist, she is the only elected statewide Democrat. And I think that she might be able to bring that up and also bring up the fact that Charlie Crist was a Republican and was the nominee for governor back in 2014 and lost. Nikki Fried has this credibility behind her name that means that she won't be that losing candidate, or she is the only one who can say, in 2018, despite Ron DeSantis winning the attorney general's race, going to the GOP by 6 points, the Republicans winning that Senate race, winning a number of, key House races, she could turn back and say, I was the only one that survived that ballot year. And also, we've seen Stephanie Murphy, a very well-known representative from the state, announce that she isn't running for governor or senator, which clears the field for Nikki Fried and Charlie Crist. Now, amongst the potential list here and amongst those who have publicly expressed interest, you have Val Demings. She seems to be peering a little bit more towards the Senate bid against Marco Rubio. It seems as if the Democratic Party is going to try to get two, strong candidates, potentially both women, on the Democratic side in order to challenge these incumbent Republicans. Looking at the potential list here, you have Gwen Graham as well. You have a couple of other people, 3 mayors. You have people that are just recognizable in the state just because of their prominence in cities, in statewide elections, in local areas, whatever it might be, you have some of these potential names. But Nikki Fried, I think, certainly would be the top best candidate for the governor election here. I don't necessarily think that Charlie Crist would be as inspirational or as strong of a candidate, just given the fact that he was the former Republican governor. I mean, you're talking about people who would be voting for Charlie Crist that potentially could have voted for him before on an exact opposite party. For Nikki Fried, she does offer that sense of realism and that understanding that she is the one who has won on the same ballot as Ron DeSantis before, that she might be able to challenge him. But it doesn't look too good for Democrats altogether. I will say that Nikki Fried announcing her bid does make the Democratic Party seem a little bit more hopeful if she is the nominee, just because she would offer that electoral experience, but I'm not going to say that she's going to win this governor bid. Looking at the polling data initially and, preliminary approval ratings and the rankings, nothing indicates the Democratic Party is going to have an easy or realistic, or not necessarily realistic, because they always have a realistic shot, but a strong chance at victory. The polling data tells us that Nikki Fried, at least the most recent one, from a nonpartisan poll, is St. Pete Polls, which shows it tied. Mason-Dixon shows Ron DeSantis with a large lead, a 9-point lead prior to that. Against Charlie Crist, the margin is, very similar, I will say. You're seeing him defeated by 11 points, seeing him defeated by 6 points, seeing him defeated by 10 points. Amongst the Republican polls, Nikki Fried does lose by around the same amount as Charlie Crist, a little bit more in the most recent Cherry Communications one. But altogether, I do want you to take away that Ron DeSantis is on the pathway to be reelected, but Democrats are trying to stop that. I mean, the fact is, Ron DeSantis will use this as a stepping stone. There doesn't seem to be a way to get around that. He is going to use the 2022 governor election in Florida as a means to run for president in 2024. And I think that that is something that could be very well possible. And Democrats are at this point where they understand that Ron DeSantis wants to take this governor bid, wants to win re-election, announce his bid, and be secure for another 2 years if he ends up not winning. And the reason why Democrats are a little apprehensive about this race is because the last time they won Florida on the statewide level was 2012. That was the last time. I mean, they hadn't won an election that was important in statewide elections, before then. And looking at the Florida Agricultural Commission's race, I mean, that was an anomaly. That was an exception to the rule. 2012, Obama didn't even win by an overwhelming large margin. Obama only won by 0.9%, which means that the state of Florida was around 5 points to the right of the national popular vote. In 2016, it was a very similar story. Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1%, yet lost the state by, 1.2%. You're talking about Florida being 4 points to the right of the popular vote in the 2016 election. And it got even worse for Democrats. Looking at the election results, Donald Trump won the state by 3.3%, which means that the state was effectively 7 to 8 points more right-wing than the rest of the country. And just looking at the election results in Miami-Dade County and other counties, you will notice that the Democratic Party saw a reduction in support relative to 2012 and even 2016. Now, I don't think 2012 is the perfect example just because of the fact that, Obama won the state. Of course, you're going to be comparing two losses, which is a better way to compare. But Clinton, someone who was viewed as a largely poor candidate, didn't, actually do too bad in this state. She won Miami-Dade County by 30 points. She was able to win in Broward County by over 30 points, win in Palm Beach County by 16 points. Fast forward to 2020, Biden wins Miami-Dade County by 6 points. From 30 to 6, that's an extremely significant reduction. Broward County gets reduced, still a 30-point margin, but less than before. Palm Beach County, less than before. What you're looking at, if you look at the shift from 2016, is that all of the states shifted towards, actually, I don't think it's going to end up showing it, unfortunately, but you'll see that all of almost all of the counties, all of the major ones at that, shifted towards the right. And that was a thing that really is in the eyes of Democratic voters, and they're questioning, what does this mean for us in 2022? What does this mean for our candidates? Well, it means that there's an uphill battle, and the fact that Ron DeSantis is popular does make it more difficult. But Nikki Fried announcing, I think, is something we largely expected for a long time, and that we are, getting this announcement, and the official campaign seems to be continuing underway after Charlie Crist made his announcements. Now Nikki Fried. We will see a competitive Democratic primary. I'm going to tell you that Nikki Fried will get more name recognition, more of an ability to appeal to the masses, but at the end of the day, the Democrats do need to face the fire at this point that Ron DeSantis is popular. He's in a pretty strong position, in fact, not pretty strong, but very strong position entering into 2022, and he will likely win that governor election if it was held today. But time can change. You have a year and a half in order to get things correct, in order to get the party and the state corralling around one candidate. And there's a lot of time for Ron DeSantis to honestly make a mistake, do something wrong, make a wrong executive order, make the wrong call that will allow Democrats to attack him and use that as a way to oust him in 2022. But Ron DeSantis, I think his eyes are set on something far further than 2022 in this Florida governor election. But for Nikki Fried, it seems that as the only elected statewide Democrat at this point, that the governor election is the only area where she can have a true impact, and she seems to bring that experience that none of the other candidates really can bring. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 midterm election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today. Sorry, tomorrow.